Hi, thank you for coming to my talk. My name is Alexis. I want to present about some research I did on the Chicago River. It's called Reconciling the Chicago River for Birds and People. All of my research is motivated by this idea of reconciliation ecology, which Dr. Michael Rosenzweig defines as the science of inventing, establishing, and maintaining new habitats to conserve species diversity in places where people live, work, and play. He poses reconciliation ecology as one of the 3 R's of conservation ecology, along with reservation ecology and restoration ecology. In reservation ecology, we preserve areas that are basically pristine habitat. In restoration ecology, we try to set back the clock on habitats that have been used for other purposes, such as Natrusa grasslands was originally agricultural land, and well, not originally, but it was agricultural land, and it's been restored to functional prairie. There are some urban examples of reconciliation ecology, such as this green roof prairie, and there are also rural examples of reconciliation ecology, such as the Strips project, where they incorporate prairie perennials into farmland, and that has benefits for the farmers and the farmland, as well as benefits to wildlife. And reconciliation ecology makes a lot of sense as a conservation strategy, because there is so much land on Earth that is human dominated and needs to probably remain human dominated. And so we have to reconcile these spaces to also support biodiversity. The Chicago River has experienced a lot of changes over the years. The top left image is of the Kinsey Mansion in 1833, which was built on the Chicago River. And so even though there's clearly signs of human establishment, there's still like the softly sloping sides of the river, there's still marshy areas. The image directly below that is what that same area of the river looks like now. This is where the Kinsey Mansion was. And now you can see that there are steep sides of the river. They're hardscaped. And that just excludes a lot of species of birds and other wildlife because of their natural history. So no marsh bird is going to look at this image on the lower left and see it as habitat. A few groups have tried to ameliorate these major changes by various urban greening projects, and one I had found out about is called Urban Rivers. They are planting floating gardens along the side of the river across from Goose Island, and these floating gardens have lots of native plants. They have interpretive signs for people to look at the plants and learn about native plants and that sort of thing. And I thought it was a really cool project. I thought it was a really great asset, and they've really only just begun the project. Their plan is to plant the entire length of that river across from Goose Island. They're calling it the Wild Mile. So when I met with them, I said, you know, I study birds. I can get some baseline data so that you can know what birds are currently there, and then in the future you can see if anything has changed. So I did, and those study points are the GOIS, Goose Island, and you can see that towards the bottom. And I also established points of study elsewhere along the north branch of the river and along the loop, just for comparison. And I established these points on Google Earth. Just they were as far apart as they needed to be statistically independent. I didn't know anything about the river before I started actually going out there and studying. So the study became a lot more interesting to me because, for one thing, I encountered some urban greening project at each of these groups, whether planned or in progress or already established. And another thing was that each of these sections of the river were really different in terms of the human demographics. So they were all qualitatively really different, and the range of biodiversity management styles and the greening projects were all really different. So I thought that was interesting. Rama is Ravenswood Manor. It's a primarily residential area. It's somewhat affluent. Lincoln Park, that section of the river only had, at the time, the Diversity Floating Wetland, which was similar to the Urban Rivers Floating Gardens project, but it had been pretty neglected. It hadn't looked like it hadn't been dealt with in a very long time. There was always trash when I saw it. And I want to talk about that section a little more in a minute. Goose Island, I've already talked about. It's primarily commercial. So there's a Whole Foods right outside of where this floating garden is. And then the loop, we all know it's extremely dense, and there's a lot of human activity. There's a river walk, and there are cafes, and there are restaurants and bars and businesses and tourism. It's a very bustling part of the city. So I started to get a little bit concerned the more I went out. This is Lathrap Homes, and it's just north of the Lincoln Park section of my study area. It's one of the first public housing projects in Chicago. And this section of the river, it hasn't experienced a lot of intentional biodiversity management, but there have been a lot of volunteer plants along the river. So it's still supporting a good amount of wildlife. Most of the area is like big box stores and parking lots. Costco is over there. But this area has experienced some controversy kind of recently. The Lathrap Homes redevelopment plan had a lot of protesters, and the redevelopment plan was happening in conjunction with a Lathrap Riverwalk, which had finished building after I completed my study. And it's reasonable for people to be concerned, not just by the redevelopment plan, because they're concerned about their ability to keep living in their homes. But the Riverwalk was a concern because sometimes these urban greening projects can contribute to eco-gentrification. So even though we think of them as really great projects for birds or for fish or for other aspects of nature that we really like, sometimes they can drive up the cost of rent in the area and kick people out effectively. There were unhoused people living under the bridge at certain sections of my study area. This image on the lower right, which is a tweet, shows that the Lathrap Riverwalk has what's called hostile architecture to prevent unhoused people from living under the bridge. In addition to my original question of just what birds are there, what bird species consider the North Branch habitat, I also developed a few other questions, such as how do these river sections compare to each other in terms of biodiversity, in terms of bird biodiversity? What factors best explain this diversity? And then how do the bird communities in these sections compare to each other? Bird communities being like what assemblages of bird species are there? So those 4 questions I have answered with my data, but still an underlying question, which I have thought about the whole time I've done this study, and I've written a little bit about it in a manuscript, is how can we increase diversity without contributing to displacement? That's not something I can answer with my data, but it is something I think about a lot, something I speculated about and have drawn from the literature, and I still want to talk about those things. So my methods, I did point counts at each of the points that I showed you. So I counted and identified birds within 100 meters of each of my points. I visited each point twice per summer. I repeated that for 3 summers. I used ArcGIS to calculate my explanatory variables. So canopy cover, population density, and distance to a major road from each of my points. And then I did statistical analyses. I did box plots to compare the diversity between groups. I used AIC to determine which is the best explanatory variable for the diversity. And then when I was looking at the bird communities and how similar or different they are from each other, I used a dendrogram. These are some of the birds I saw. These aren't all of the birds that I saw, but these are the birds that I am considering aquatic species. So some of these aquatic species are, it's really obvious why they're in this group. They live or forage on the river. They're things like herons and ducks. But I also included a few species which are a little more general, like they tend to live in forests. But from the literature, it says that they tend to prefer forest habitats near water, so near a river. A lot of these species you won't be surprised to see in the city of Chicago, but I still think the majority of these species are pretty exciting to see. So when I compare native bird species richness is just the number of species. When I compare all native birds, it's unsurprising that the section of river near Ravenswood Manor, which has 2 big intentional parks, intentionally managed for conservation parks, and also the Riverwalk neighbors, that has the most birds. And Goose Island and Lincoln Park, those sections of the river are very comparable in terms of bird diversity. The Loop, unsurprisingly, had very few birds, very few species of birds. But when I look at the aquatic birds, Ravenswood Manor is actually really comparable to Lincoln Park and Goose Island. And again, the Loop had almost no species of birds. So when I look at what explains this bird diversity the best, all native bird species richness was best explained by and positively correlated with canopy cover. So where there are more trees, there are more birds. That's unsurprising in a lot of ways. Aquatic native bird species richness was negatively correlated with population density. So where there were a lot of humans, there were not a lot of birds, and where there were fewer humans, there were more birds. So this figure looks at the actual communities of birds, what kinds of birds are encountered at each point and how similar they are to each other. So there's a lot of overlap, and there's some distinction between the groups. It's nice to see that they're not all the same, because that's something that you hear a lot about in like the impacts of urbanization on wildlife, is that there's really low beta diversity. Like the species that exist are the same everywhere throughout the city. So that's really encouraging to see that there's some beta diversity. Something else that I thought was particularly interesting, again, this figure shows the points that are most similar to each other in terms of species composition. They're clustered closest together, and the height of the fork kind of shows how similar they are to each other. So the two most similar points are Lipa 4 and Rama 1. And what's interesting to me about that is that Lipa 4 is right next to a parking lot of a big box store, and Rama 1 is right next to an intentionally managed conservation area. So that just shows like there's a lot of potential for the river to support wildlife, and it doesn't have to necessarily be in what we might think of as a conservation area. So a few things that I got from this. One is that I think future river conservation projects should focus more on supporting river-specific species. It's the only river in the city, and it's kind of special, so we need to optimize it for the species that need it the most. Another thing is that different management styles are okay, and they can be guided by, in part, by the demographic context of the people around the area. And I think that having a diversity of management styles can lead to greater diversity in the area as a whole. For example, in an affluent residential area, biodiversity management can be driven by residents. Biodiversity management may even be funded by the residents. Residents are unlikely to be displaced by urban greening efforts, and so go nuts. In primarily commercial areas, biodiversity management can be an opportunity for engagement and education, and it can be incorporated into recreation. A dense city center is not likely to support very much wildlife in spite of best efforts. However, if we concentrate all the human activity or the bulk of the human activity in the loop, instead of having human activity sprawling in vast numbers throughout the whole river, it kind of alleviates other parts of the river and allows them to maybe function as better habitats. Again, the best explanatory variable for aquatic bird species richness was population density. In residential areas where the residents are economically vulnerable, we should be avoiding negative impacts of biodiversity management, such as eco-gentrification, and that needs to be an explicit goal. We can focus on inconspicuous biodiversity management efforts, so efforts that are maybe not as visible and are less likely to attract someone to, build a cafe and other things that might drive up the cost of living in an area. What could that look like for the Chicago River? So the picture on the left is how a section of the river looks now. None of that vegetation is intentional. And I think that's okay sometimes. I think just leaving it as it is, it still supports some wildlife. We can also do intentional things such as changing the surface of the sides of the river to allow for certain kinds of nesting species. So these are bank swallows. I didn't see any bank swallows in any of my study points. I did see lots of other kinds of swallows. So what I get from that is that there are food resources for swallows, but the sides of the river, which are either corrugated metal or concrete, are just too hardscaped for these cavity nesting species. I think that's a change that we could make with very inconspicuously and very inexpensively that will support wildlife without contributing to eco-gentrification. And I think if we looked at the natural history of other bird species that I didn't encounter in the Chicago River I think we can think of other ways to support those birds as well. Another option is to just provision downwoody debris. Downwoody debris contributes a lot to biodiversity, not just for birds, but for fish. And that's something you can do that doesn't look ugly, but it isn't going to, again, attract a cafe and a high rise and that sort of thing. Something that contributes to wildlife but doesn't contribute to eco-gentrification. So with that, I want to say thank you to Urban Rivers for inspiring this project. I want to thank Chicago Public Transportation because I really could not have done this research without you. I want to thank the residents of Chicago who tolerated me doing fieldwork so close to your homes, especially to the unhoused people who lived under the bridges, who were extremely kind and extremely tolerant, and I really greatly appreciate that. Thank you very much.
And Alexis, now I'd invite you to turn on your camera and your mic. I think there are a lot of great questions that are coming up in the chat. And there's a little bit, and so that you and the audience know, there's a slight delay between what we see of each other here on the stage and what is going out there. And so I'm curious about maybe as a way in, if you could tell us just a little bit by way of context about how this research fit into the larger project of your dissertation.
So each of my dissertation chapters was on a different urban habitat in Chicago. The cemeteries and community gardens were my two other data chapters. And I didn't originally intend to make this part of my dissertation, but I just got really sucked into it and couldn't stop thinking about it and just like had to write about it. So yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some great questions coming up in the chat. So I think I can leave it to you for a few minutes if there are ones you want to pick out from the chat to address.
Sure. How much time do we have overall?
We're going to try to wrap up around 3:15. So we've got about 6-7 minutes.
Okay. So Judy asks whether I think the river habitat is more important for the nesting birds or migrants. That's a very good question. I don't know for whom it's more important, but typically when you're trying to evaluate habitat quality, it's good to look at the breeding birds because you'll see migrants that could just be passing through, could see it and say like, no thank you, and then leave. That's why I chose to look at breeding birds, but I do think it's an important resource for migrants as well. Stephanie says eco-gentrification is a really important idea I had never thought of. Yeah, I'm great. I'm grateful that you think so. There's a whole like body of literature about just green enough as a response to eco-gentrification, so that we can still have nice things and nice habitats for both people and wildlife, but without contributing to it. And it's something I've barely scratched the surface of, but I think about a lot. Can floating islands or habitat for, say, swallows be added along the loop area? So there actually is at least a few floating gardens in the loop, and there also are a lot of barn swallows, at least under the bridges in the loop. But I think that the loop, like any nature, would be for like beautification for people and wouldn't really support a lot of wildlife because it is so densely populated and there's just so much activity that I think it scares off a lot of wildlife. Okay, I'm missing. I can't remember exactly how I measured human population density. I used census data. Obviously I have it written down somewhere, but I can't remember exactly. And I didn't look at like how much, I didn't look at multiple radii as far as like how far from the river is population density a factor. But I did think it was interesting that like the proximity of like a major road was an important factor. So I think that maybe you could still have an area like densely populated, but still like at a distance, it wouldn't make such a big difference. I don't know. The riverbank neighbors site started about 25 years ago before the bubble and gentrification. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, Pete, I definitely agree. I didn't know much about the Riverbank Neighbors area. I just thought it was like a really cool park. I did a little bit of research about it, but I thought it was really cool. Yeah, and I think like ideally we'd be able to have urban greening everywhere, and like everywhere could have wonderful parks. But I think we need to do things like support community land trusts and stuff like that, so that we can establish areas for people to continue to live in and not get pushed out by nice things. So yeah, the sort of just green enough approach is valuable, but it's not, it alone won't make the situation just. Beth Ling, I did not set up spots on eBird for that. I feel like it could be useful. Like I feel like it would be really cool to have it like a continued project. However, I suspect that people are going to want to go where like all the cool birds are. Yeah, so I feel like a lot of people are not going to want to go to the loop, and so that maybe these same study sites wouldn't be as useful for crowdsourcing because people are going to want to go where it's like pretty nice parks and stuff like that. Okay, is visiting each site just twice during the summer going to give accurate results? Right, yeah, so it won't give me like, it won't tell me every bird that's ever been there or ever will be there. But if I have the same sampling effort for each of the sites, it gives me a fairly good comparison between the sites. So being able to compare the sites in terms of their communities and species richness, it's a fairly accurate, if not precise. Like there are obviously going to be birds that I'm not going to see. No, I didn't, not for this study. I didn't take into account dead migratory birds. I have done research in bird window collisions in the past, but just like on my campus, not along the river. All right, thank you, Mike. Thanks, everyone.